Devil's Clay is not a city. A city must be called up by human minds and raised by human hands. That collection of houses could never have been fashioned by human hands, no more than the trees in my dreams could have been nourished by earthly soils. Whatever its true nature, I have always been enthralled by tales of Devil's Clay. I remember when I was young, overhearing frightening stories about the place while everyone thought I was asleep. These terrible but thrilling tales crept into my ears from beyond dark hallways and deepest night, whispered by trembling shadows whose hushed voices seemed to speak from somewhere beyond the world. Within my first dreams of Devil's Clay, I would walk the one road that connects our town with it, or I would stand before it, looking directly in. It never made any attempt to conceal itself from me, nothing beyond hiding beneath a tattered blanket of rotting wood, sullied glass, and cracked stone. It only stared back at me through lidless, rectangular eyes, no doubt hoping that I might cross into one of its many open mouths by means of crooked doors. However, in later dreams, I looked out its windows and ascended into shadow-striped attics. I sat across from its endless citizens at darkened tables piled high with quivering meats, and I slept within its broken cellars, wrapped in the silence of forgotten places. Though I have lived all my life in Greywich, a hushed town that cowers from its only neighbor, I have learned only that Devil's Clay is not a city. The elder residents of Greywich sometimes hinted at the true nature of Devil's Clay, though they would never unfurl a complete tale, for what would they be once they exhausted their dusty, antique secrets? The wrinkled sages at Jenner's Diner, in between sips of spiced apple cider and bites of rhubarb pie, would often speak of older times before Devil's Clay had been built. They said the earth where the city now stands would only tolerate thorn bushes, weeds, and legions of some rank and unknown flora, strange plants beloved by storms of locusts and other foul pests. The Whitebeards were also quite fond of recalling some nameless and awful deed allegedly performed by a number of the early pioneers. They said that on the very spot where the earth lay ill and angry, a group of would-be colonists murdered a number of their own group for reasons that remain much debated. Verger Fry was a compulsive yarn spinner, as well as the third oldest man in the county, and he would often blame this mysterious and historical crime for the dark spirits that live beneath Devil's Clay. Ain't no surprise the earth didn't take to no rotten proper crops. It's done seen too much blood that's healthy. Maybe it was wanting more of that than water. It's seen more bodies planted in it than seeds. Maybe that's how he who finally worked it done it. He gave it what it wanted. Whatever the reasons for that hateful patch, settlers still came from far and wide, eager to try their rough hands at working the land. But as before, only weeds and poisonous plants would grow, a mocking assortment of herbage thick with stink and insects. Any structures fashioned upon the dark ground would all fail to stand, sinking unevenly into filthy muck, or altogether and swiftly decaying, sending hopeful shelters to the demonic dirt. In time, locals and settlers alike abandoned all hope of converting the soil, and so the area became known as the Devil's Clay. For what thing besides Satan himself could reason with such wicked earth? Like any folklore, these stories tended to change somewhat, depending upon which ancient you spoke to. It is equally true that the hoary crowds of Greywich regularly agreed on one single matter: the person responsible for the rising of the shadowy, secret town. How he came solitary and strange to the twisted earth, how he alone was able to draw forth a city from barren and sinister clay. His name was only a whisper. Even the boldest of elders wouldn't speak it aloud. What further restrained the full articulation of this name is that it still lives on, embodied in a man believed to be the latest descendant of the clay's bizarre founder. he is the mayor, or perhaps simply the town elder of the Clay, what most of us Grey Witchers call that wicked place, and can be seen most often in the dimming twilight, driving his polished black Packard down the one road that connects his city with ours. Dooley Clummett was the one and only mortician in Grey Witch, and once whispered the fearful name to me while I assisted him in a nightly excavation, the price of his tale. He said the mayor himself, Grey Mathers, had come to him late one evening, asking to purchase an unclaimed ring that still encircled a dead man's finger. Both finger and ring belonged to a particularly ostracized citizen of Grey Witch, for whom we were digging out new accommodations. The deceased had been accused, but never convicted, of killing large numbers of local livestock. He was also thought to act out strange rituals while wearing their skins. Old Eva Mears claimed to have seen the man creeping on all fours in her pasture. She said he wore a suit of animal hide, and that multiple heads from various farm beasts were sewn all over it, the eyes of which shot wide, panicked looks at her. It was only after the man was found dead of a heart attack inside a local farmer's pig pen that his costume was recovered from his home. The offending article was promptly burned on the slopes of Gallows Hill, and the dead man swiftly delivered to Dooley for disposal.
Mathers kept asking me if I was sure the ring was always on the left finger. Said he weren't no friend to the right hand.
Dooley seemed to shrink down under the growing weight of his account as a puzzled look crossed his face.
He said the ring wouldn't grow true in no Grey Witch dirt, and he'd seen to its proper planting back in the Clay.
The one and only mortician of Grey Witch appeared almost exhausted from the telling of his tale. He looked even worse when, on our way back from the graveyard, we passed by the road to Devil's Clay, a single set of wide tire tracks that displaced the moonstruck dust, still floating in the air.
I sold the ring to him for an even 100. Dead's dead, and money's money after all.
Those were the last words I ever heard from Dooley Clummett. He moved away the following week. The people who purchased his place found a scorch-marked $100 bill nailed to a dead pine tree behind his house. They said it looked as if the burn marks were in the shape of a handprint. It was too bad. Morticians who dig their own graves are few and far between. Silas Moon was once Grey Witch's reigning Clay storyteller. He presided unchallenged over that dim historical period that stretches from the raising of the city to the end of its occupation by those more customary families. He would always begin his lively recital with his familiar,
"As you know, the Clay literally grew up overnight, with its houses like wooden witches. The whole place was eager to give dark haven to the lost and homeless, and even more eager to snatch it away again."
Silas was a ghost of a man whose dust had nearly surrendered entirely to the blowing winds of time. Yet, he claimed that certain dark secrets preserved him from the white clutches of the bony death angel. Once, I asked him whether he had any secret tales about Devil's Clay that he kept out of his famous storytelling sessions. He looked up from his cup of coffee and said,
"Some secrets just won't go to the grave. They gotta live on till they get to put a soil on the world. And so long as I keep them locked up, they'll keep me from blowing into the never."
I became a regular enemy of Mr. Moon's immortality, seeking out his death-defying secrets. After all, what use are secrets, if not to ruin those who keep them? As it happened, Mr. Moon descended from a family who had once resided in the Clay, and he'd even kept a journal of the wickedness that had swept through the town. For the first few years, the dread town was typical. Its predictable erosion was indistinguishable from the decay found chewing away at any other city of the time. However, according to Moon's journal, even within those outwardly quiet times, evil was walking barefoot in the darkened streets.
People started acting queerly, putting on their worst faces and taking up with their worst spirits. Everyone was living in their own shadows and loving the worst of themselves. And when that great flaming eye of God closed on the horizon each eve, the devil came out to dance. Of course, the whole town was invited to the wing-ding, as they all bedeviled until God's good sight was renewed upon the morn. Now, it's true not everybody danced to the devil's tune. The fact of the matter is a couple of the goodly folk actually tried to raise the town to the ground. But, in the end, all the decent folk could do was run.
Mr. Moon then proudly recounted the stirrings of people and industry that would eventually become Grey Witch. His fine ancestors had fled from the horrors of Devil's Clay, only to assist in the building of our small city. What he failed to include in his purple tribute to the olden moons was the ultimate wickedness committed by his own zealous great-grandfather, the baleful priest, Zedekiah Geth. It was none other than Moon's own black-hearted forebear who had overseen the hanging and burning of poor Elsa Marie Thomas, the ill-fated Grey Witch of the Low House Woods. However, Mr. Moon no longer has the privilege of sidestepping his offensive family blight. Since his passing, perhaps he finally loosed one too many secrets. Whenever I tell his tales, I'm careful to confiscate Moon's once sterling pedigree and replace it with the appropriate historical accuracy it deserves. I'm sure he would not have approved, but secrets have ever been the bane of their keepers. While some secrets won't settle for the grave, others won't tolerate being kept. He should have known better. Secrets want to be told. Now, for all that has been whispered and feared about the evil city and the putrid earth that shoulders it, it is not a ghost town. After the dark exodus prior to the construction of Grey Witch, there were people who still lurked behind the shunned bounds of Devil's Clay, those who never left and had no want to do so. It must be assumed by the occasional reports, given mostly by the few thrill-seekers who enter the clay and come back, of lighted windows and strange people meandering the unlit streets, that those ancient families who remain behind continue to reproduce. And while uncommon, there are also those instances where strangers come from outside, people who apparently seek out homes within the city. It was once told by Belle Haleness, my former third-grade instructor, that she had been visited by one of these odd persons on their dark pilgrimage to Devil's Clay.
It was about sunup, and I was tending to my roses in the yard. Roses are fussy things, you know. I had just turned around to fetch my watering can when, all of a sudden, as if from the thin air itself, appeared this little man. A dwarf, really. He stood about head level with my lemonade table in the side yard. He wore the most outlandish outfit I had ever did see. A black, white, and red suit, and above his tiny white face sat a black top hat, the kind you might expect to see at a ball or some such. He also had what looked to me like a bunch of dead flowers tucked into the lapel of his coat. He kept looking up at the sun, and with no small bit of agitation. He made an awful face when it struck his pale little cheeks under that big funny hat of his. Before I could send him away, he handed me a little white card. It read, "Hello, my name is Master Yeckelgens, and I require shelter before I get on to my new home, the next city past. Perhaps you could accommodate me for a single day." He seemed to sense my disapproval, not to mention the fright he put on me. As if to waylay what he knew was going to be an unhelpful answer, he struck out his white-gloved hand and poured out a shining stream of gold coins. Now, I'm not one to be bribed, mind you, but there seemed to be no real harm in his staying, only the one day. I opened my front door to show the odd little man to one of my guest rooms, but he pointed to my stable and gestured to the coins in my hands. Well, I guess I just couldn't see past all those pretty coins. Besides, I couldn't imagine what such a little fella could do to my horses, so I waved him on, and off he went. I was gone for a great deal of the day, off checking to see if those coins were worth anything. I left Gregor, my big old yellow lab, in the house, just in case the little man should try something sly. It was about nightfall when I got back, and Gregor was howling up a storm. Aside from all the noise he was making, he was just as fine could be. But when I went to check my stables, all I found were empty stalls. I was so busy looking for my horses, I missed the weird writing scrawled across the top of the door to my house. It was written in a language I'd never seen before, and it was drawn in what looked to be some kind of brownish honey. It even smelled sweet. Then, just before I opened the door to go inside and call somebody about what had happened, I heard the panicked squeal of a horse high above me. Turning around, I heard a loud thud near my flower garden. It was a horseshoe, buried more than halfway into the ground. On top of that, it was covered in frost. In the middle of July, for heaven's sake. In the end, I didn't really press the matter. Reason being, those coins he'd given me turned out to be worth a fortune. But don't you think I'm not full of shame about the whole thing? I'm still ripe with grief over what might have happened to my horses. But those coins, they turned out to be real old, from back in Roman times. What was written on them was the same as what was on my door, some kind of Latin. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil, you shall eat of it all the days of your life, till you return to the ground, as from it you were taken. George Porter down there at the museum told me it was a quote from the Bible. I'm not sure why the little man wrote what he did, but it sure is a mighty peculiar thing to be writing on a person's door.